It began the night the eviction notice arrived on her doormat, typed on cheap paper. Stamped with a city seal she'd never expected to recognize against her name, and Tamsin stood on the porch with a cardboard box under one arm and the kind of perfect, rehearsed surprise people keep for later apologies. I watched from across the street under the yellow spill of a street lamp, the light softening the edges of her face into something almost innocent. And I let her go on believing that fate had finally been cruel in the most honest way. Her husband, Jonah Reed, had left the week before with all the boxes that had a label and the kind of apology that sounds like a rehearsed poem. She'd told everyone he'd needed air, and that they were taking a break. Nobody suspected how quietly a life can rot from the inside out when the foundations were built on other people's mercy. I didn't strike in fury. I worked like a woman learning the anatomy of a storm, slow, deliberate, mapping pressure points where she had staked everything. The gallery co-op she'd leaned on for credibility, the small loan that kept the studio solvent, the landlord who liked tidy tenants and tidy payments. My revenge would not be loud. It would be geological, erosion, patience, weathering, so that when her future slipped from her fingers there would be no dramatic collapse, only the soft, inexorable falling of everything she thought permanent. I bought the gallery's failing second space through a proxy, the way people buy silence. Legal names, polite emails, a handshake over coffee that tasted faintly of burnt grounds and steel, the kind of cup that smells like the last true thing you owned. Then I hired her favorite curator to a contract that paid her more than the co-op would ever manage, and I sponsored a city grant that rerouted the kind of public funds her studio depended on into a community arts trust that would no longer underwrite outsider collectives. I placed an anonymous call to the financial advisor she'd trusted, just a question about a late tax filing, and from that thin thread the auditors appeared with their polite clipboards and questions nobody can hear without guilt rising like smoke. It was architecture of absence, a missed payment here, an unexpectedly revoked lease there. Patrons who forgot to renew their membership. Tamsin woke one morning to a voicemail from her landlord saying management had decided the building would be converted, the contractor's truck already idled across the street. She called Jonah, who answered from a city 4 hours away, voice hollow with the surprise of a man finally finding himself in someone else's narrative. And she sobbed into the receiver. I watched the line go dead and felt, for a moment, the dizzy vertigo of someone who has chosen a rigorously moral cruelty. There were nights I pressed my forehead to the cold glass of my kitchen window and let the scent of dried lavender, the small bundle I always carried in my pocket like a talisman, flatten the sharpness inside me. I burned one of Jonah's shirts in the sink, watching the fabric curl and blacken. A ceremonial erasure that tasted less like triumph than like a small, private exorcism. Once, when Tamsin turned up at a city board meeting to petition for emergency funding, I sat 3 rows back and listened to her voice fail under the weight of paperwork and public pity. She thanked the council with a smile that trembled at the edges and left without the grant. Later, I mailed her a plain envelope containing nothing but a photograph. A child she'd once tutored, eyes bright, now holding a scholarship letter that bore my signature as a trustee of the foundation that had just funded it. I didn't write her name on the back. I wanted only the image to be a small, insolent proof that futures can be redirected. People ask if I felt guilty. Sometimes, when the late summer rain made the city smell like iron and onion, when I woke at 3 a.m. and heard the echo of a drawer closing in a building I could no longer find on the map. I felt the old ache of kinship and the question of what line I'd crossed. But kinship had been a thin thing in our family, worn smooth by favors and taking. Tamsin had taken the man I loved, not by love but by convenience. And then built her life on the assumption that the world would always rearrange itself for her. In the end, I realized my work wasn't punishment so much as an education in consequence. I left a window open one autumn morning and watched the light fall in a rectangle on the hardwood where her easel had stood. Dust motes turned in that square like slow galaxies. And for the first time in years, the apartment felt like a place of possibility instead of negotiation. Years later, at a charity auction where she stood in a dress that had once been mine, I bid on a piece she'd claimed as her signature and won it for an amount that made her notice. She watched me sign the card with a small, incredulous mouth, and then, later, she moved away with what was left of her hopes folded in a suitcase. I did not gloat. I did not watch her leave. I only walked home under the same yellow light, the cracked pocket watch in my coat ticking the way old grudges do, steady, inevitable. Revenge, I learned, is not about stealing joy, it is about reclaiming the future someone else tried to spend for you. And that's when silence became the loudest revenge. She was my sister long before she became my rival. I never saw it coming, how betrayal could sound so casual in someone else's laughter. It started small, late-night texts between her and my husband, Jonah, that she swore were about family matters. I wanted to believe her. You always want to believe the people you've built your life around. But then came the dinner party, the way his hand brushed hers when they passed the wine. The silence between them charged and practiced. By the time I confronted her, she didn't even bother to lie. You were never enough for him, she said, eyes cold and certain. I just finished what you couldn't. I left that night, quietly, taking nothing but my son and the truth. She thought she'd won. They moved into my old house within a month. She redecorated, of course. New curtains, new paint, same foundation. I watched from a distance, the way one studies an animal that's trapped itself. The thing about my sister was, she'd always built her life around being admired. She needed an audience more than she needed love. So that's where I began. I knew her business, her precious boutique. The one funded by a quiet investor who didn't like publicity. I also knew her weaknesses, her habit of borrowing, of signing documents she never fully read. It took time, months of patience, quiet calculation, but I found the thread. A debt consolidation firm she'd used. A minor default she thought she'd hidden. I bought the note, quietly, legally. She owed me now. When she missed a payment, I sent a letter. Professional, detached, signed by an alias. The look on her face when she called me, panicked, trembling, unaware she was speaking to the sister she'd betrayed, wasn't satisfying. It was clarifying. Please, she said, I can make this right. And she did, by unraveling her own empire one asset at a time. I watched her sell the things she loved most to pay a debt she didn't understand. Until all that was left was the house she'd stolen, the one I'd left behind like a shed skin. I could have taken that too. But I didn't. Instead, I let her keep it, empty, echoing, filled with the ghosts of her own choices. Jonah left her 6 months later. He told people she'd become unstable. I didn't correct him. The day her boutique finally closed, I walked past the window and saw her inside, packing boxes alone. For a moment, she looked up and saw me. No words. No apologies. Just recognition. She knew. And in that small, perfect silence, I felt something colder and purer than revenge, closure. Because she took my husband. But I took her future, the things she valued most. And that's the kind of justice no one can undo. She was my sister before she was my enemy. That's the part that still stings, the fact that betrayal didn't come from a stranger, but from the person who used to braid my hair, steal my clothes, finish my sentences. When she took my husband, she didn't just steal a man. She stole the version of me that believed family meant safety. You always had everything, she said the night I found out. I just took what you didn't deserve. They didn't even bother hiding. Within months, they were living in the same house I had picked out, sleeping under the same roof where I'd once dreamed of growing old. My mother begged me to forgive. My friends told me to move on. But forgiveness is not a language I speak fluently. And moving on is never the same as letting go. So I waited. I studied her, quietly, patiently, until I found the pulse of her new life, and then I began to press. My sister had always wanted recognition. She ran a startup, some self-branded wellness company that promised transformation through discipline and feminine energy. It looked good on paper, sounded better on social media, and was entirely built on debt. I knew her accountant. I knew her suppliers. I knew that if one rumor, one carefully phrased piece of doubt, found its way into the right inboxes, her empire would start to crack. So I made sure it did. Slowly, strategically. First came the inspection notice, then the sponsor withdrawals. Contracts vanished like mist. Her investor, my husband, though she didn't know, pulled out when he realized the brand's value was plummeting. He'd invested half his savings under her name, thinking it was love. I made sure the market saw it as fraud. By the time the papers went public, she was facing lawsuits, debts, whispers she couldn't silence. And him? He left her once the money was gone. She's changed, he told a mutual friend. I smiled. No, I said. She's just been seen clearly for the first time. When her company collapsed, she called me. I answered. You ruined me, she said, voice trembling. No, I replied. You ruined yourself when you mistook betrayal for ambition. Then I hung up. Months later, I saw her working in a cafe downtown. No makeup, no followers, no empire. She didn't notice me. Or maybe she did, and couldn't meet my eyes. I ordered a coffee and left a tip, a generous one. The way a victor thanks an opponent who made her sharper. Because she took my husband thinking it would make her powerful. But I took her future to remind her that power isn't what you steal, it's what you build after surviving the fire someone else lit for you. She was my sister before she became the kind of woman who smiles while taking what isn't hers. When I caught her with my husband, it wasn't cinematic, no yelling. No throwing of wine glasses, just the quiet click of a door and the sound of two people breathing wrong. She didn't look sorry. You never saw him, she said. Not the way I do. And maybe she was right. Maybe I saw him too clearly to keep pretending he was worth seeing at all. They left together that night. The family whispered about how love finds its way. As if betrayal was just destiny dressed in better lighting. I stayed silent. There's power in silence, in letting people think you've broken while you're actually taking notes. I let them move into my old house. Let them host dinner parties in the kitchen where I'd once burned lasagna and hope in equal measure. Let them live the story they stole, because I knew stories built on theft always end the same way, with rot. My sister, Dahlia, had always wanted control. She wanted the kind of success that looks effortless. Her new husband, my old one, financed her ambitions, a wellness company, a lifestyle brand. The usual fragile kingdom made of hashtags and unpaid taxes. I didn't need to destroy her. I just needed to give her enough rope to hang herself, with a little help. I started small. One phone call to the local business bureau about irregularities in her trademark filing. One anonymous email to her investors about her personal reputation. A whisper here, a delay there. The world did the rest. When the financial audit hit, it took everything. She called me crying once, voice raw, half drunk. They're saying I falsified documents. I could lose everything. I listened, quietly. You already did, I said, and ended the call. By the time the lawsuit landed, he'd left her too. He moved to another city, remarried, this time to someone less complicated. Or so he told mutual friends. Dahlia was left with the shell of her brand, a pile of debts, and a reputation that smelled like smoke. I saw her again years later, at our father's funeral. She looked older, not in years but in the way guilt drags the soul. After the service, she approached me, trembling, eyes wet but empty. You got what you wanted, she said. I studied her for a long moment. No, I said. I just stopped letting you take what was mine. As she walked away, I noticed her hands shaking, the same hands that once took everything from me. And for the first time, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph. Just quiet symmetry. She took my husband, yes, but I took her future. And between us, only one of those losses is permanent. She was my sister before she became my punishment. There was a time when we shared everything, clothes, secrets. Even the small hope that love might save us from becoming like our parents. But she always wanted what was mine. I should have seen it sooner. The glances she gave him at family dinners, the way she laughed too loud at his dull jokes. When I found out they were together, it wasn't from confession or rumor, it was from a photo. Them, hand in hand, in the same cafe where he once proposed to me. She captioned it, "Second chances are still love." I didn't cry. I just closed the app and started planning. They thought I'd disappear, that I'd fade into the role of the heartbroken sister, quiet, pitied, safe. But grief, when fed long enough, becomes strategy. I knew her weaknesses better than anyone. Dahlia was reckless with money, attention, and men. She'd built her boutique skincare brand on image, not integrity. Half her products came from unverified suppliers. Her investors were blind to the shortcuts she took. I didn't need to expose her lies, just nudge them toward the light. So I did. I created a small blog under a pseudonym, one that reviewed luxury wellness brands. With transparency, I started with praise, small mentions of her company. Just enough to build credibility. Then, slowly, I began releasing what I knew, faulty batches, unlicensed ingredients. Client complaints. Nothing false, just the truth she'd buried beneath perfume and PR. By the time the health department launched its investigation, she was too busy defending her reputation to notice I'd acquired her supplier contracts through a third party. When her shipments stopped, so did her revenue. He left her not long after. Said she'd become obsessed with enemies. She told friends I'd ruined her life. I smiled when I heard that, because ruin, in her case, was simply reality catching up. Months later, I saw her at a charity gala we both used to attend. She looked fragile, haunted. You did this, she whispered when our eyes met. I sipped my wine and said, no, you did. I just handed you the mirror. She didn't speak again. She just walked away, heels clicking like a clock counting down the end of her own story. Now, her company is gone, her savings burned through. Her name whispered in caution instead of envy. I've rebuilt quietly, moved cities, started consulting for small women-owned businesses. The kind that don't hide their ethics behind filters. Sometimes, when I see a news article about failed beauty empires, I think of her and wonder if she ever wakes up missing the version of herself that didn't envy me. Because she took my husband and called it fate. I took her future and called it balance. And between us, only one learned that love stolen from someone else always comes with a debt, and I was just the one who came to collect.